Taxes are becoming more of a hot topic in Washington, D.C., and some of the plans being proposed would have disastrous impacts on rural Ohio and rural America as a whole. Proposed legislation in Congress would tax capital gains at death and eliminate what's called stepped-up basis as a way to raise revenues for government spending, causing Farm Bureau to issue an action alert to all of our members. I'm Ty Higgins, Senior Director of Communications with Ohio Farm Bureau, joined by Jack Irvin, Vice President of Public Policy. And Jack, a lot of things to break down here, and taxes. And as simple as it may sound, there's a lot of complexities in the conversation.
Yeah, I can't help but think of my grandfather of, talking to me about the two certainties in life. You're going to be faced with death, you're going to be faced with taxes. And obviously here at Farm Bureau, we want to try to minimize one of those certainties, and tax policy is certainly a big thing. And it's convoluted, it's a little confusing. We're talking about estate taxes, we're talking about capital gains taxes, we're talking about stepped-up basis. They all are separate and distinct tax provisions. But collectively, they all work together, and they can either, create some opportunities to pass on that farm to the next generation, or unfortunately, in some of the proposals that we're seeing, create some very significant challenges to keeping that tradition going and make it, frankly, extremely difficult to carry on that farm.
Yeah, we'll get to stepped-up basis and capital gains and the devastating impacts they'll have in just a bit. But some positive things happening in Washington as far as Farm Bureau is concerned when it comes to estate tax.
Yeah, so there are some provisions out there to completely eliminate the federal estate tax. Farm Bureau has a long history, very supportive of that. We were successful here a number of years ago in Ohio. Ohio used to have our own state estate tax, and we were successful in getting that repealed with a lot of other partners across the state. And we'd love to see that tradition carry on at the federal level and get that estate tax completely repealed. Of course, it's more commonly known as the death tax. And that's a tax that the heirs or the estate would pay at the time of death of, the principals of whomever owned that farm.
Stepped-up basis is something we've talked about now for a little over a month. As soon as it started being talked about in Washington, Farm Bureau's ears kind of perked up, wondering what the Biden administration might come up with as far as the possibility of eliminating stepped-up basis. For those that don't know, give us a 30,000-foot view of what it is and what the elimination of stepped-up basis would mean for family farms.
So in its simplest form, it's just a way to revalue the farm and machinery, etc., just all those assets at the time of death and transfer of those assets. So say the farm was purchased and valued at $50,000 X number of years ago. At the time of death, it's now valued at $200,000, so there's $150,000 of capital gains on that asset, those lands, and say that heirs take that over, it steps up and kind of resets that clock, so to speak. So it steps up the value of that farm now to the current value, which is $200,000, which is important. If you need to sell a portion of that ground off because maybe the equipment's outdated, you need to reinvest a little bit, you're not going to get hit with that capital gains on that big difference of when the farm was originally hit. Or say you want to keep it for several more years, the land increases in value to say $300,000. You're going to only pay that cost differential between the value of the farm from when it was transferred to the value of what you're selling it as. So unfortunately, if that would go away, it certainly would create a lot of potential concerns down the road, which could be very, very significant.
Literally make or break type of situations.
Absolutely.
Where a family might have to sell some or all the farm just to pay the tax bill because stepped-up basis has been eliminated. You mentioned capital gains taxes, and that kind of works into this stepped-up basis and this estate tax conversation as well. How?
So this is actually a provision that's probably a little less understood, but I would argue even a bigger issue. So there's discussions. So talking about that capital gain, so we're getting rid of that stepped-up basis. There is talking about at death that you would have to pay pay taxes on that gain. So going back to that first example, say that farm was $50,000, it's revalued now at $200,000. You would pay capital gains, which currently is up to 20%, a 20% tax penalty on that $150,000 capital gains, and that would be at the time of death. So they might not call it an estate tax, they might not call it a death tax, but in practice it really is. And keep in mind, this would be in addition to the estate taxes. Those would not necessarily go away either. So there are certainly exemptions and all kinds of different exclusions to that. But, if you had to pay a 20% tax all of a sudden that you weren't expecting on assets that appreciated over those number of years, wow. I mean, think of the challenges that's going to present. And in our industry, very asset rich in many areas, but very cash and liquid poor. How do you come up with that kind of cash to pay that type of tax bill? Unfortunate reality is a lot of people will just have to sell to be able to pay their taxes, and that's completely against what we've advocated for years, and trying to be able to help people pass on that farm to that next generation.
Farm Bureau releases action alerts if they feel an issue is of importance and if the rhetoric's starting to build in Washington, and we've seen that happen here with some tax proposals. What's this action alert telling our members to do?
Go tell your story. You hear us talk about this all the time. Unfortunately in agriculture, it's an expensive business. So you can look extremely wealthy on paper with a lot of assets and land and equipment, etc. And to maybe some folks in Washington, it's like, that's a great community to target and tax. Well, our message is simply, hey, we're trying to reinvest in these communities. We're trying to be here for generations to come. And if we're getting hit at these massive tax increases at the time of death, it's nearly impossible to continue on that tradition. So these could be, nothing short of devastating if a lot of these taxes would move forward. So we're saying let your congressional leaders know the impact some of these provisions could have on you personally and just what it means for your community.
You can find a link to the action alert from Farm Bureau in the description of this video. Jack Irvin is Vice President of Public Policy with Ohio Farm Bureau. I'm Ty Higgins. We'll see you down the road.